Good afternoon, and welcome to this session of the Berkeley Writers at Work seminar series. My name is Tyler Stovall. I'm professor of history and dean of the undergraduate division in LNS. And in spite of that, I actually spend time in the library and I actually spend some time writing as well. So it's my very great pleasure to introduce today's session. I first want to thank Steve Tollefson and John Levine for their work in organizing this seminar series and today's session in particular. So our featured writer today is Professor Rudy Mendoza-Denton, who is a professor of psychology at Berkeley. He's been here since 2002 when he completed his PhD at Columbia. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I have to confess that because my own father was a psychologist and a child psychologist is that, my relationship with that particular discipline has always been, shall we say, somewhat conflicted. Nonetheless, I recognize good work when I see it, especially if it's not done by my father. So I think we're up for a very exciting session here. Professor Mendoza-Denton has written widely, very, very widely, on a broad number of topics, especially focusing on the question of stereotyping and prejudice, looking at stereotyping from both the perspective of the target of the prejudice and from the stereotyper, him or herself, and looking at the ways in which these ideas that we all have structure our own ideas about life in our communities, our own individual lives, and the world as a whole. His work has been published both in psychological scholarly journals and in much broader public venues, such as the Huffington Post. He also is an active blogger and has been a frequent contributor. You've probably seen his name many times on the UC Berkeley webpage, weighing in on various topics having to do with prejudice, difference, and race on campus and the world as a whole. One of the things that interests me about his work, and this is true of many psychologists, I think, but not true of, for example, many historians, is that if you look at his vita, much of his work is co-authored. And it'd be interesting to hear him talk about, perhaps, what it's like to write in collaboration with somebody else, and how that both enriches and perhaps challenges one's own process of writing. Finally, I wanted to signal something he mentioned in one of his pieces of work. This is what he calls the spotlight effect, which I found tremendously fascinating. The spotlight effect seems to be the idea that, well, we might think we're the center of the universe, but the universe has other ideas. That part of what saves us in our daily rhythms is the fact that the rest of the world really doesn't care that much about us anyway. There was a wonderful Jules Feiffer cartoon, I'll try and bring it up for you at some point, that many years ago that basically made the same point. It features a woman having a dialogue with God. And she's saying to God, well, at first I thought you were always on my side, but then I was wrong. But then I thought you were against me, but then I was wrong again. And then finally I realized you really didn't pay much attention to me at all. And therefore I figured as long as that was true, I had a fighting chance. So I'm glad to hear that Professor Mendoza-Denton's work has confirmed the insights of a famous cartoonist. And I'm very much looking forward to hear what he has to say. He will be interviewed today by Professor John Levine, who is one of our leading lecturers in writing here and is, among other things, an award-winning playwright. So I would like to, again, thank all of you for coming, and thanks both to Professor John Levine and Professor Rudy Mendoza-Denton for what's going to be, I'm sure, a very wonderful hour. Welcome.
Thank you. I had papers here.
Oh,
okay.
Sorry, this is part of the test of this event. You have to fly solo.
Thank you. All right. First of all, I am, it sounds kind of trite when people say this, but I cannot believe how many people are here, and just the deep honor that I feel for this. I really mean it genuinely. I'm flabbergasted, and I thank you for your time. So I'm a professor of psychology, and just recently I became director of the Greater Good Science Center here at Berkeley, and our mission is to translate psychological findings related to the science of a meaningful life to the curious and interested public. And so if you're interested, check out the Greater Good Science website. There's an email newsletter sign up for that. And that's really such a nice convergence of my interests and my talents, which have always been really just about that, about making our science relevant. And it's part of the reason I became a psychologist in the first place. So I look forward to speaking with Professor Levine about all of these issues. But I figured that probably the best way to start getting to know my work and getting to know me is by having you listen to some of the stuff that I've written, and you'll see that there's a very personal narrative that is interwoven along with these issues that try to explain things like the spotlight effect, which I'll actually read in fact. So I decided that instead of reading from longer pieces, I would read to you from some of my blogs, and I understand that this is among the first times that you've had someone who's in new social media. And so I think these blogs are a nice way to sort of, capture people's attention for relatively short spans of time, and then we'll move on. And I'll pick from among both my favorite ones as well as some of the ones that seem to resonate with readers on the website. So let's go ahead and get started. And as a first one, I thought that I would pick the one that's most relevant for today. And that particular piece is called Writers and Parents, Show, Don't Tell. One of the cardinal rules of writing is this: show, don't tell. The rule means that when one is trying to describe a character's actions, a writer should avoid describing inner states when possible, relying instead on showing the character's actions. You can think about it as if the writer's job is to describe a particular movie sequence faithfully. Instead of describing his or her interpretation of the movie sequence faithfully. Rather than say, he really gets nervous when he saw her, for example, you might say, as he saw her stroll into the ballroom, his eyes grew wide. He began to feel as if his bow tie were tightening around his neck. Some of my favorite authors, Stephen King, Michael Crichton, Alice Sebold, are almost cinematic in their prose, and reading them is like watching a long, delicious movie screening privately in your head. In this post, and there's links to those, you can see the cardinal rule in action. I was at my 6-year-old son's soccer practice the other day, reading about attachment theory, and as it happened, I started reading an article entitled Self-Esteem and If-Then Contingencies of Interpersonal Acceptance, Baldwin and Sinclair, 1996. This article is a classic, suggesting that people in contingent relationships, that is, relationships in which a loved one's affection is contingent on certain behaviors, such as getting good grades, more strongly associate failures with rejection and may be at risk for low self-esteem. Sitting by the bleachers of the soccer field where my son practiced, my heart dropped as I read the following paragraph. Little League sporting events provide an excellent opportunity for observing the interpersonal roots of self-evaluative styles. At a recent soccer game, one player's father strode up and down the sidelines, yelling at his son to do something with the ball. If the boy managed to kick the ball in the right direction, his father beamed approvingly and called out, "That's more like it," or "That's my boy." If, instead, the younger player was unsuccessful, his father seemed angry, frustrated, and ashamed of him, often yelling out nothing more than a tormented "No!" and burying his face in his hands as he turned away. Many psychologists would suspect that repeated experience with this kind of interaction might have an impact on the boy's sense of self. I looked up at my son as he kicked the ball around, wondering how much I was like that father, trying to encourage him, but instead deflating his self-esteem. See this related post. That night, I, of course, showered my son with love, and as night fell, we sat on the bed and talked about dragons, kings, and wars in which bold warriors fought with swords for honor and chivalry. As his bedtime arrived, I looked into his eyes before speaking. "Son?" "Yes," he replied, stifling a yawn. "You know I love you, right?" "Yes, Dad." "You know that some children feel that their parents only love them if they score goals or get good grades?" I gently took his face in my hands and continued. "Well, I want you to know that I love you no matter what. I will always support you, regardless of whether you score goals or not, regardless of what college you go to or what grades you get." His gaze squarely met mine, and he furrowed his brow slightly. We sat in silence. He was clearly formulating a thought. I waited for him. Dad, he finally ventured. I held my breath. Yes, son? He reflected for one more moment and then asked, would your eyeballs bleed if someone takes them out with a sword? I buried my head in my pillow, trying not to wake up his baby brother with laughter. Show, don't tell, I promised myself. Show, don't tell. And at his next soccer practice, I clapped and nodded even when his passes went astray. So this one is actually the spotlight effect that Professor Stovall talked about. It's called the spotlight effect. Playing sports in middle age against college students can be humbling. The other day, I was playing basketball against a taller, quicker, and, well, younger guy. He accelerated to the basket, and trying to stay in front of him, I lost my footing and unceremoniously fell on my butt. I bounced a couple of times before coming to a stop. Nobody said anything, and my first thought was that everyone was privately laughing. I was mortified, but as I got up, I reminded myself of a psychological phenomenon that always helped me get through embarrassing moments. The trick also works when I'm worried about the impression I will make in a new setting, such as this one. The phenomenon, called the spotlight effect, refers to the fact that people considerably overestimate how much attention other people are paying to them. Being the center of our own worlds, our own actions and words loom quite large in our own perception, but the spotlight effect reminds us that we simply do not loom quite as large in the eyes of others. In a 2000 paper published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, Tom Gilovich and colleagues demonstrated this phenomenon empirically. In one study, the researchers brought in groups of students to complete an unrelated task in the same room and randomly assigned one of the students to put on an embarrassing t-shirt. If you must know, it was a t-shirt of Barry Manilow, which the researchers had previously established was highly embarrassing for this college population. The researchers asked the students wearing the t-shirt to estimate the percentage of people in the group who would be able to identify the person on the t-shirt. While the students placed their estimates around 50%, in reality, only 25% were able to identify Barry Manilow. Importantly, when other students were asked to watch videotapes of these groups and produce a similar estimate, their estimates were also around 25%. Thus, it seems that wearing the t-shirt specifically had the effect of heightening the perception that other people pay more attention to us than they actually do. The effects went beyond Barry Manilow. In a second study, participants were allowed to choose a non-embarrassing t-shirt, this time with a picture of Bob Marley, Jerry Seinfeld, or Martin Luther King Jr. Again, the t-shirt wearers estimated that 50% of others would be able to identify the person whose picture they were wearing. In this study, less than 10% of their group members actually did. A third study extended the findings to behavior, showing that in a group conversation, people regularly overestimate how much people notice their brilliant contributions or their embarrassing feet in their mouths. The reasons for the spotlight effect, as I alluded to earlier, have to do with the salience of our own actions in our own perceptions. People generally, of course, know that they are not the center of everybody else's universe. But when we do something atypical, either good or bad, we tend not to sufficiently correct for the difference between our own and other people's perceptions. The take-home message, I hope, is clear. When you find yourself mortified or overly worried about the impression you'll make, remember that other people simply don't pay as much attention to you as you think they do. Your conversational faux pas will not linger in their memories, and that coffee stain on your shirt is unlikely to be a conversational topic at the water cooler. You will not make or break a first impression on the basis of one particularly brilliant or embarrassing thing you say. This is not to say that people don't notice you at all, only that people do not process information about you as deeply as you do. In other words, while you're stuck ruminating, people have likely moved on. No big deal. I should know. I ran into one of the players on the court from a few days ago at a cafeteria and mentioned how embarrassed I was after falling on my butt. His response, I kid you not. Really? I don't remember that. This is one of my more popular, thank you. This is one of my more popular posts. It's called Resolved, Find Yourself Some Trouble, and then I'll probably read one more, and then we can move on to the Q&A. Resolved, find yourself some trouble. I once heard that problems need to be understood in the context of development. Losing your favorite teddy, for example, can be as devastating for a 3-year-old as losing your house can be for an adult. Reflexively, we might say that this is a trite comparison, given the downstream consequences of losing a house, but this misses the point that allows us to empathize with the devastation a 3-year-old can experience. I sometimes have to remind myself of this when my kids experience emotional extremes over small things. Take my 6-year-old, for instance. The other morning, I asked him to put on his socks and shoes while I dressed his little brother. 5 minutes later, I found Big Brother still sitting by the door, barefoot and pouting. As I approached, he threw his socks across the room and started crying. "I can't do it," he wailed. "I'm dumb." Usually, we wouldn't use socks as diagnostic tools for intelligence. Yet for him, seeing everyone except him do this so effortlessly must be endlessly frustrating and full of import about his own ability. If you follow this blog, you'll know that one of the themes I often write about is that we can view our abilities as either fixed or as something we can grow and develop, with the latter view being more adaptive for coping with frustration. Here, with socks of all things, was a perfect opportunity to reinforce the idea that we can grow our intelligence, an idea that he had only nodded to, but I could sense was not really getting when frustrated with math, reading, or drawing. A key aspect of the Grow Your Intelligence message is the implication it has for the experience of difficulty. If one believes that abilities and intelligence are fixed or wired in, then experiencing difficulty on a task can only mean one thing: that one must not have the correct wiring, genetic makeup, or inherent ability to succeed at a given task. It's very easy to come to this conclusion in the face of failure. I received a message from a student of mine the other day who apologized for not doing well on the exam, and she remarked, "I must not be cut out for this." However, if one believes that intelligence is malleable and can grow with practice, then the very psychological meaning of difficulty changes. Difficulty now indicates that you are activating your intelligence, that you are flexing and practicing your skills. Difficulty is to ability like water is to a growing plant. As such, you become resilient in the face of trouble. A study by fellow PT blogger Heidi Grant Halverson showed this clearly among pre-med students taking a very difficult science class. Those who didn't do so well in their midterm, but who had learning goals, did much better in their second exam, compared to those who were focused on their grade rather than on learning. So I gathered up the socks and showed my 6-year-old slowly how to put them on. You make sure they're not inside out. You line up the heel with your own. You open them up with your thumb so that your foot goes in more easily. As we did it, I realized I had forgotten how hard it actually is to put on socks. So many things to keep track of. He looked at me with a pained expression as I told him, "It's good that it's difficult because it activates your intelligence." The same reaction as with the reading and math and coloring. I tried other ways of saying it. "See, trouble is good," I tried. "It turns on your intelligence." I had basically already put on his socks while we practiced, but as I stood up to chase his little brother down, I actually took off his socks again. He stared at me as I handed the socks back to him. "Here," I smiled, "have some trouble." He looked at me with wide eyes, and then the most amazing thing happened. He cracked up, just started laughing at what I had told him. At that moment, I knew he got it. He finally understood what I meant about trouble and practice. He still put on his socks all wrong, but I was a proud, proud daddy. So, consider a class that you know will be difficult, a gym routine that will be a challenge, or a new skill that you fear you may not be cut out for. In short, go find some trouble, and a pair of nice socks to go along with it so you can remember this post. So what do you think? Time for one or two more? Okay. This one is a very personal one, not the most popular one by any stretch, but a very important one to me. It's called A Meditation on Life After a Mother's Death. "Here," my mom's oncologist said, handing me a thumb-sized vial of her spinal fluid, "take this down the street for analysis." Too shocked not to do exactly as told, I reached out over my mom's anesthetized body and took the vial. It was still warm. I slipped it in the little pocket of my jeans, the one where only your thumb and forefinger will fit, and headed out in the direction the doctor had told me. I fumbled past the flimsy curtain that separated my room, that separated my mom from others in the ICU, past all of the other patients, some comatose, some crying, others in the middle of surgery, and stumbled out into the sprawling metropolis that is Mexico City. There was nothing I wouldn't have done for my mom that day, even as I knew that the spinal fluid analysis would only confirm that her cancer had spread to her brain and there was nothing left for us to do. Cancer, after all, is an ironic survivor and perversively finds a way to infiltrate the central nervous system where toxic chemotherapy drugs won't reach it. Carrying that little vial through the open-air market that separated me from my destination, I felt like some kind of misplaced soldier carrying a miniature wounded comrade through a war zone. The whole experience had a surreal quality about it that seemed diametrically, almost sarcastically, opposed to the sterility of the vial in my pocket. Roaring buses spewing roaring clouds of smoke, open-air taco stands with TVs tuned to the drone of the World Cup, a security guard to the hospital entrance making out with someone while people walked freely through the gate. This was the chaos of Mexico City. 20 million people, each going in a different direction. Yet, as I rushed through the market to deliver the warm fluid, I felt an utter loneliness and silence, as if I were but a jellyfish buffeted this way and that by the enormous, anonymous current that is watching a loved one die. You are not in control. You are swept, invisibly and inevitably, towards the final moment when they will come to rest on the ocean floor while you continue to be swept away. My mom made me promise that I would never write that she had lost a brave battle to cancer. She recoiled at the false sense of agency that the analogy of battle implied. Yet, in our day and age, it is precisely that sense of agency that keeps us going in our daily routines. The reason we rush to work, the reason we insist, tiger-like, that our kids take gym and piano lessons, the reason we follow presidential debates, all in the hopes that we and our loved ones will have a brighter future that we've played some role in shaping. Forced to interact in the world of the agentic, when mourning a dying parent, one feels invisible, detached, driven by a different set of currents. Bring up the topic of death, and you receive sympathy, but true to form, it is like spreading electric poison tentacles into the conversation. This memory came rushing back to me as I read over an editorial in the New York Times that appeared recently at that time. Do read it. Written by the mother of a terminally ill child, the essay is a meditation on what it means to have a deep relationship with someone when you know you cannot plan for a future with this person. And the lesson is particularly poignant when that relationship involves your child. The essay is by turns sad and centering. When your loved one's future is limited, time perspective is reduced, and the focus of life becomes the here and now. Loving the person and making sure they are comfortable, bathed, warm. Meals together become ends unto themselves. No tiger mothers with big plans. The only plan is to love. Not many of us will experience a relationship such as the one described in the New York Times editorial, but many more of us will live through the experience of a parent or older relative passing away. These relationships are an opportunity to celebrate life. They are also our parents' most lasting lesson, learning to enjoy fleeting moments with loved ones in the moment, with no agenda or plan ahead, only to enjoy each other's company and give of oneself with no expectation of return. It is the gift of realizing that, even in a world of tigers, there are currents out there that are stronger. It is a memory that helps me put away my cell phone or close my laptop when my little ones are tugging at my leg or begging to play Pokemon. That is a battle hymn of the jellyfish sun. It is not a battle already lost. Rather, it is a battle cry for the importance of being present in one's relationships. Okay. So if you'll indulge me with just one more, this is actually one of my favorite ones, and you know, it's actually slightly more uplifting. So, okay. As any working parent knows, sometimes you have to think creatively to juggle work and childcare. Just recently, it was my turn. I had to teach. My spouse was busy, and our 5-year-old son was out of school. So I decided to take him to my 250-person lecture. There he sat in the front row, flanked by 2 students. I was proud of him when he shared his candy with them. They, in turn, gave him paper and a pencil. As he settled into drawing, I started class and was soon comfortably in my teaching groove. That is, until about 10 minutes into the lecture, when my son suddenly raised his hand. It wasn't a cool college hand raise. It was one of those incredibly eager, hyperextended, falling out of your chair hand raise of a grade schooler competing to be called upon. 500 eyes immediately went to him, and the room went totally silent. Trying not to grimace, I called on him. His eyes went wide with delight, and with a huge grin, he blurted, "Blah, blah, 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 blah." The auditorium roared. In this magical moment, somewhere between Peanuts and Monty Python, everyone understood a 5-year-old's perspective on the Socratic method. The next class, with my son back at school, we all laughed again at the moment. But, now serious, I took the chance to tell them my fear that when I began talking about statistics, some students only hear, well, blah, 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 blah. One student told me so point blank after a lecture recently, disclosing that she mostly followed the lecture, but that when I started in on the lingo, her eyes literally glazed over. It was a gesture that I deeply appreciated because she was admitting a trouble spot for her at the same time that she was giving me feedback and reaching out. It was also courageous. Instead of taking the path of least resistance, disengagement, the student chose to face the fear many students share to simply and irreducibly chalk to not being good at math. This type of self-narrative, I'm just no good with numbers, or my natural gifts lie in this and not that, I was born to do X, all share a common assumption that what we are good at comes from deep within and is somehow pre-programmed within us. In other words, it is not subject to change, and our task in school then becomes to find what we are bad and what we are good at. Consider for a moment how much our culture emphasizes this immutable notion of ability and personal qualities, from the personality tests in magazines that promise to tell you who you really are, to IQ tests on the internet that can quantify your intelligence, to the reliance on ability tracking throughout the educational system. It even shows up in the praise for our children when we say to them, "You're smart." In each of these instances, the culturally shared assumption that our abilities are fixed is both reified and promulgated. The assumption can be dangerous for learning. Imagine yourself as a youngster faced with some easy math problems. You get all of them right, and proud of your achievement, you show them to a teacher or parent. They smile approvingly and say, "Wow, you're so smart." This is exactly what Claudia Mueller and Carol Dweck did in an experiment in 1998, but they added an additional twist. While some of the children received the feedback that they were smart, other children received the feedback, "You must have tried really hard." Both types of feedback praised the children, but the key difference was that one of them emphasized innate or fixed ability, "You're so smart," and the other emphasized the role of the kid's effort, "You tried hard." Here is where the experiment got interesting. In the second phase of the study, all of the children were given really difficult math problems, which all of the children, by design, did poorly on. The third phase of the study was the critical one. Having all experienced failure, all of the children were again given simple math problems, very much like the first ones they all did well on. The results were startling. Whereas the children who had been given effort praise did better on these new problems the second time around, the children who had been given ability praise did considerably worse on these new, similarly easy problems. Research shows that when we adopt a view that our abilities are fixed or immutable, things go great as long as we keep doing well, but really fall apart when we experience difficulty. Why? Because if you have an immutability mindset, experiencing difficulty or doing badly can only mean one thing, that you are in fact not smart, or at best, simply bad at this subject. Given this, what is there left for you to do? Disengage, dismiss the lingo, and let your eyes glaze over. By contrast, when we adopt a view that we can grow our abilities through effort, we experience difficulty as challenge and as a learning opportunity, and adopt a goal of learning. In short, an effort mindset buffers us against the difficulties that all of us are bound to face when learning new things. My students and I are about to take a midterm in the lecture class that my son sat in. I'd show them this clip on the first day of class, and I can think of no better time to remind them of it than now. And then what I did is I showed a YouTube clip that having no access to the computer or to YouTube at the moment, I will tell you about. It's a clip of Michael Jordan, and it's a commercial that he did in 1998, I believe. And Michael Jordan was, at one point, the biggest superstar in basketball, considered by some to be the greatest. So Michael Jordan gets out of this limousine, and Jordan was the coolest of cool cats. He's wearing an overcoat and sort of flowing out a little bit like a superhero. And the voice comes on in the background, and he's just, he's walking clearly into the locker rooms, and it's kind of slow, like cameras are flashing, people are going like this, and he's just waving back. And in his head, he goes, in this deep baritone, almost bass, he goes, I've missed more than 3,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 600 games. And he's walking, people taking pictures. 26 times, I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot and missed. I have failed over and over and over again in my career, and that is why. And then he opens the door and it closes, and that is why I succeed. And it's like, oh, it's beautiful. Okay, so that's it. Thank you.
Do you have a preference which side?
Okay, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
Thank you all for being here and for listening.
And thank you. Thank you for joining us
You're very
today. I'd like to begin talking a little bit about, well, first of all, I want to confess that I printed, as you did, I printed out your blogs. I have a whole stack here, and I thought, I can't confess this because that's so old school and that's so wrong, printing out blogs, because blogs are meant to be read online. So I want you to talk to us a little bit about, well, there's a number of different directions we could go, how you came to blogging, why you do it, and how it fits in with the rest of your life.
Well, first of all, I think that a disclaimer is probably due, and I think it's a disclaimer that's appropriate because I think it also helps us understand that things like blogging and writing do not exist in this vacuum. That disclaimer is that I actually haven't blogged for about a year. And that's because of the many different constraints and difficulties and just sort of challenges of daily life. So that writing really is one of these things that it takes time, it takes effort, it takes closing your door. And in the midst of trying to sort of also be a successful parent, a successful academic, it becomes really hard. I came at it because I've always had this bent towards writing. So I wanted to be a writer ever since I was little. I was an English major in college until I realized that most of my interests were actually in this funny psychological arena. So I would read, Jonathan Kellerman, like all the crime novels, the serial killers, etc. And then it kind of hit me, I'm really interested in writing for what it tells me about people. And that's sort of how I entered into psychology. Many years passed and I got tenure, and I happened to get an offer from Psychology Today to start blogging for them. And I kind of gave it as a gift to myself for tenure. Sort of like when you're an academic in psychology and in many other scientific disciplines, you write these long articles and they take like years and years and years and years to get published. My dissertation, for example, was published 10 years after its completion. So it takes a little bit of patience. Whereas blogging was such a wonderful way to not have an editor, just sort of you put it up and then there it goes. So that's kind of how I did it. You saw from the blog about my mom that there's considerable range in what you can talk about, but also there's this sense in which you can connect with other people and really make things accessible. That's part of what what Greater Good Science Center does. And as our mission, it feels really good to be able to do that, not just to talk to your colleagues who you're going to see at the conference anyway, right? But rather to other people. It's funny that the spotlight effect that Professor Stovall mentioned, that blog has just gotten, I've gotten personal thank yous from people for that.
Well, I want to personally thank you actually for that too.
You're quite welcome. So it's nice to know that you can have that impact. And what I love is that it's an impact through writing, if that makes sense. So I always talk to people in my class. I teach this writing seminar at Berkeley about your words being like your ambassadors or your little soldiers that go out and represent you. And depending on how aggressive you feel, they're ambassadors or soldiers. So it's just really nice to, or maybe even doctors, right? Nice to be able to use and have the impact of words. So. I forget what the rest of the question was. But,
it was, you answered it. I did too. But along those same lines, so you do reach an audience. I assume you have your audience in mind when you're blogging. You also get immediate feedback, or you could get immediate feedback. Talk a little bit about how that's different from academic writing.
Actually, it's both different and the same. It's different in the sense that people post comments to the blog, and one is often told that if you want to grow your audience and your membership, et cetera, then you should have dialogue and conversation. But that's incredibly time consuming because there's a lot of comments, a lot of them you don't know what to do with, and then some of them could be quite hurtful actually. That is a really important dimension of blogging, or just putting stuff up that's widely read. That you're going to get reactions of that kind of run the gamut, no matter what. And that was a tough learning experience, as opposed to the more tightly controlled, empirical article publishing, which you're not as much invested in it. Well, of course you're invested in, but at least they're kind of vetted, and they go into the worst that can happen is that you'll be ignored, or that the findings won't make their way into the mainstream literature. But I think in blogging there's also like the opportunity for very negative reactions, and one has to. So it was a wonderful way to develop thick skin. The way in which they're actually very similar is that the impact of your writing doesn't show up for a while. So I thought, Psychology Today, I'm going to get, like X number of hits, and if I posted a particular blog and, I got 250 hits, it's very disappointing, particularly because Psychology Today puts them up, and then, and there's this sort of competition set up, which, whatever. For a long time, in fact, pretty much for until I stopped, I was very much not one of the top bloggers, right? I would see people who would write like these blogs, and they'd get like 1 million hits in 24 hours, and here would be my little blog with 250, hits. So that kind of felt crummy, and I think that was part of why I lost the motivation to stop. Unbeknownst to me, like 8 months, 9 months, even a year later, these little blogs are coming and giving me kisses on the cheek. So I get interview requests. I recently went back in and noticed that the number of hits had actually like exploded. So even though I haven't contributed, as evidenced by this event, it keeps coming back, and that's actually very true also of your academic findings. They just take time to grow, and some are hits and some are not, and your favorites are not the audience's favorites, and
right.
So it's
right.
But it's all about writing, and
right.
I have to say there's also something really cathartic about just writing. So research shows that keeping a diary is very healthy for one's mind, and in my case the blog was pretty much the same.
And do you see it as a diary? I mean, way back when, if I'm not mistaken, blogs were web blogs, right?
Yeah.
That people kept as diaries. So as you are writing, I mean, to me, they're articles. They're fully formed, and I see them as pieces that could stand, online or offline. Do you see them? A lot of them are personal narrative. When you begin a blog, I guess what I'm getting at is your writing persona.
Sure. Well, you'll see that you see that they're personal narratives. The most personal of the personal narratives was the one about my mother. But you'll see that most of the others, engage the reader with a personal narrative, right? But then they move on very quickly to exploring a scientific concept or an empirical phenomenon. And that, I think, is something that I learned to develop. I think I always had a tendency to do that. I didn't read some earlier pieces that I've written about, but, you know, and I was even trying to do it in my empirical work, but, you know, it's hard to do that. So the blog allowed me to sort of explore these ideas freely. I actually think it made me a better teacher in some ways. And the process was very much, you know, I said to myself, you know, I'm going to write a blog a week. And I would, you know, read the New York Times, you know, I would, you know, be sitting on coffee, and things would happen. And I'd say, oh, that reminds me of this. Maybe I can write about that, right? And so there's themes both, you know, and oftentimes these were just, these just sort of fit nicely, and it's a consequence of the chronic accessibility. What that means is that you're constantly thinking about both the writing, the stuff that you want to write about, and looking for that opportunity to meld it in. In blogs, there's also an opportunity, for example, to react to pieces of news that come out. Right, so when, for example, Jared Loughner, the Arizona shooter came out, there was a whole thing about mental illness, and that was a popular blog. So there's that kind of strategy too. But I tended more to sort of try to spontaneously look for stuff in the world that I kind of wanted to write about anyway, and then see it pop up. Yeah. There's other bloggers in my field, for example, who look at articles and then work from the article to the blog, if that makes sense. In other words, it's driven by the nature of the piece. Right.
But as you said, and I should clarify, they are personal narratives, yet they truly make, as you said, science relevant. Then you'll cite a study, then you'll talk about, you know, an experiment that was done. What we call in the writing game is there's a hook. There's a great hook. You get us in, falling on your butt in the basketball game. Then you bring up another topic. So I think it's just masterfully done. I've read many of them. But while we're talking about the personal narrative, and again, I'd like to address an issue that many of my reading and composition students talk about is using the first person, I. I'm assuming that isn't something that you were trained to do in writing about psychology, correct? I mean, it's different. You're stepping over a line when you do that in terms of academic writing.
Oh yeah, and you know, I have a whole thing with academic writing, which is that oftentimes, you know, the experiment was conducted in a laboratory, and participants were instructed to go to the room, and they were given, and you know, it's like, where, you know, and so now there's a movement in psychology towards like saying we, you know, and yes, like you actually, you know, led the participants to this room, like you had this idea, kind of thing, and that all intersects with as we were talking about collaboration, et cetera, et cetera. But as I mentioned, I've also always been interested in writing. So that idea of that annoyance with passive voice, which sounds so academic and distant, you know, also helps protect us as writers from really taking responsibility of our words, right? And in some ways, the whole scientific enterprise, at least in psychology, can do that as well, where it's academic, it's out there, but it's not really relevant to me. And that's always been hard for me as a prejudice and stigma researcher. So I've worked hard to sort of keep that communication open between the personal world, the personal narratives, and the psychological phenomena that I study. There was a recent article, and I believe it was in Science, that reading historical fiction like Chekhov, etc., helps promote, you know, empathy, etc., whereas reading sort of the trashy novels does not. You know, independently of the quality of that research, I think that there's something about understanding psyche and understanding inner motivation that really speaks both to writing as well as to psychology. And you know, I was in so many plays as you know, in college and high school. Always have been writing, and so it's something that I do with joy now at the center, right? Which is exactly that, trying to sort of bridge that gap.
Since you're so open about sharing life experiences and your own life, with your permission, I'd like to ask you a little bit about your own writing process.
Yeah.
Do you have a writing routine? Is there a time that you write, a way that you write?
I have a narrative about my writing routine, and then there's real life. I have a couple of students here from my lab, and at some point I'll expect those students to take my writing workshop. And what we always say in the writing workshop, and when we're in the writing workshop, we do this. We say, you write at a specific time every day, or X number of times a day, and that's what you do, right? There's no magic, no mystery about it. My favorite story from writing actually came from a story that I heard when I was in a seminar at Yale called Daily Themes. And the story was that they brought in this writer, this very famous writer who came completely drunk to the affair. And he walks up to the podium and he's like, "So you want to write?" "Well, write." And he left. Right, and that's it. And you see that theme really reified by every single writing book. Right, there's a lot of sort of how-tos, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, you just have to sit down and write. And the best way to do that is really to have a fixed schedule where you write every single day. Another great piece by B.F. Skinner, the famous behavioral psychologist. B.F. Skinner talked about stimulus response. Right? And in the same way that therapists advise you, if you have, for example, sleeping issues, not to watch TV in your bedroom at night, because what you want to do is associate the behavioral act of sleeping with the context around you, sleep, right? And one becomes the cue for the other. Writing should be the same, in the same place, in the same room, and the behavioral script is called forth by the context itself, and it's very powerful. Whereas I used to spend all my time in college seeking that perfect window, or being like, I think I'll put the lamp on this side, right? Or going for walks because I really had to think through my ideas. It doesn't work. You just gotta write. And I was just in Free Speech Cafe this morning writing it doesn't quite matter what I was writing, but I've been dreading it for like 2 weeks. Okay, because it's a letter to an important colleague, and I'm rejecting his paper. Anyway, and I just had to really write it. And in that writing process, your ideas come out. They really do. And then you can edit them and you can play with them, but writing helps thought. And that's one of the fundamental things I've thought. Where my narrative differs from my actual reality is that I just have such a hard time writing at a specific time. And it may be a function of my personal history, of my personal space right now, where I have little kids who are always waking up. I'm trying to, stay fit. I have like 800 meetings, blah, 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 right? But I can't seem to privilege that writing time. And it's so annoying because it conflicts with what I tell my students, which is that your meetings and your activities feel so incredibly important. They're like the little fires you have to put out. But the big fire that matters, the one that's going to get you that job, the one that's going to propel you to that publication, it's a long way away, right? Those outcomes, but you have to do it on a daily basis.
And you do it by hook or by crook. You make sure that you write.
No, I don't.
You don't. Okay. Just wanted to clarify.
I struggle with it a lot,
Okay.
and then I have these binge writing episodes, and then I stay up late, and then I'm a mess for a week, right? And then there'll be like 4 weeks when I'm like completely disheveled and walking around because I'm writing this thing, So I have a lot of trouble with discipline.
Okay. And that's encouraging,
Thank
to
you.
me anyway, just that I'm not the only one. So in college, you looked for that perfect window for the light, and nowadays, can you write anywhere? I mean, I know it's still a struggle,
Yes,
but
I can, because my laptop has become that object where, I had this self-narrative that if only I could, this is constant to what I was saying, if only I had that light or that view and I could get inspired, and once I sort of realized that that's not true, and the book that really changed that for me was Stephen King's On Writing. Best book, period, about writing. Bar none. Once you sort of realize that, you realize that all those excuses, right? So help me realize that when I had a paper due, it didn't matter where I was, right? And that realization that if there was some kind of external motivation or influence, all those things about motivation and inspiration really fell out the window because I had to do it. So it's been a struggle, but I can do it now. You sit down and you write it.
So there's no ideal writing situation for you. Ideally would you have no kids, I don't mean permanently, just while you're writing, silence, coffee, tea?
Silence doesn't work for me. It really doesn't. No. I like coffee shops, but then they play annoying music in the background. So I try to do like the rain thing on my computer, the sounds that stream in, et cetera, et cetera. So I've tried a million different ways, and there's no ideal. But once I sort of hit that groove, like this morning, I really hit a groove for about 45 minutes. I did what I wasn't able to do for 2 weeks, and it's endlessly annoying to me that I suffer for 2 entire weeks thinking, what am I going to write? And then it sort of all comes out, and then you revise, and that revision period is not that long. So most of these blogs, when I was really grooving on that blog, a lot of these blogs really were, I would say, about 2-hour affairs at most. A couple of hours, you put it aside, and then you touch up a phrase or move a paragraph, and then they were out. So when I'm rolling, I'm rolling.
And has that changed your academic writing, blogging?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's a lot more freedom, a lot more permission to the self to write something nonsensical on the open page. And then you go back and you were like, yeah, that's not so bad. Or there's not a perfect way to say it, but this will kind of do. But what the blogs have sort of helped me do, and I don't know that I can really verbalize this super clearly, John, is that there's an organization that's common both to the blogs and to the academic writing, and that is that there's got to be some kind of hook, right? So consistent with Stephen King, in the writing workshop, we used to call it the dead body. Kind of like if you're writing, right? If you're writing something, or you're watching an Agatha Christie movie, the motivator is really the dead body, right? So we used to talk about, like, where's the dead body here? Like, where's the crime to solve, right? And that's kind of what you see in the blogs. There's this problematization of a phenomenon or something that interests you, right? It doesn't have to be creepy or gory. That's not what that means. Mm-hmm. But there has to be some kind of, puzzle. And then you suggest a way to solve it, right?
Do you find the puzzle first, or do you have the topic and then you try to find a way in? Does it work one way or the other?
Well, I talked a little bit about how I do that in the blogs, and that it's sort of like there's an experience and that reminds you of something, right. And the experience is itself enough of a hook.
Okay.
But when you're doing a program of research, yes, you really do have to find the correct or an appropriate hook for the writing, and sometimes students and I go through 3, 4, 5 drafts where it's just not working, and you don't really know a priori what that appropriate framing should be. It's not quite as hooky. It's really not. Mm-hmm. It's more sort of a problematization. Like, why is this an important phenomenon that we need to study, right? What is unresolved in the literature? And often we don't really know that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Just to jump topics a little bit, because I do want to talk about collaboration, especially when you're working with students, because you've published a number of papers with students. Tell us about the process there.
When we were first talking, when I was sitting over there and the issue came up about collaboration, I smiled because I have a very distinct memory of the moment when my graduate advisor took me seriously. we were, so I must have been, I was pretty late. I was a very advanced grad student, and we were writing a paper together. And finally, I got him to sit down with me, and he was sitting, well, and I was standing, and he was trying to type out something. And I was like, no, Walter, no. This is Walter Mischel, who created the marshmallow test that many of you will know. Mm-hmm. And I'm saying, no, Walter, no, don't do that, because that doesn't, and I had this, I think already then I had this idea of where I wanted that sort of foreshadowing. It's a funny foreshadowing that you do in academic writing. And he slams his glasses down, and he goes, he looks back at me, he goes, well, what the hell do you want me to do? and I was like, and I said, can you type this? And he typed it, and then he moved on, right? And so that's kind of when he's wonderfully gifted in being able to be mad at you in one instant for functional reasons, and then not have it be a big deal afterwards. And that's really hard for me as a highly interpersonal individual. For example, on the basketball court, like guys will just like go at each other and then be fine at the end of the game, and I'll be like crying for the day. So that's that. I remember that sort of being taken seriously, but also that collaboration and like there's disagreement and you can get over it and it's fine. So with my students, it's very much depending on the order of authorship and such, we, oftentimes they'll write a first draft and I'll give very broad comments. And then as the draft kind of moves forward, I'll provide more detail, but not actual writing. I'll provide comments and see if you can do this, see if you can do this. And then depending on where we are and what the deadline is for submission, how much I understand from the student that they're actually trying to take what I say into account, because you have all kinds of writing relationships with students as well. Then I will sort of engage in writing, because you want to be really careful that you're not imposing too much of a heavy hand on the student.
So in a sense, you're an audience in the beginning, right? As they're writing their first draft and you're giving them feedback.
Well, no.
Okay.
No, in that I'm not passive by any means. I'm in fact biting my tongue, because I have a very specific notion of what I think should be done. But there's this little narrative, this self-narrative that says, "Don't go there yet." And also the narrative that it could actually change. And there's, you have to also understand that it's their paper too. And at the end of the day, if you disagree, maybe that's okay. And for professors, that's a very difficult thing to do, because the longer you're in the position, the more you're treated like you're supposed to profess and tell people what to do, right? So we get these inflated heads, and it's just hard to stay humble and realize that your students can actually have ideas too. Okay. So I try to keep that in mind.
So staying on collaboration, how is it similar or different from collaborating with peers, with colleagues? Does one write a first draft and the other comments?
It's a similar kind of negotiation. I mean, I'm sort of hedging on that question, because the process of tenure has been such that I was told relatively early on, right? You need to make sure that you establish yourself for the tenure review as an independent author. Like, students are okay, right, to collaborate on, and you're expected to collaborate. But if I participate or collaborate with a colleague, right, then there's ambiguity about whose work it is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, particularly with senior colleagues. So I kind of stopped writing with colleagues, and I haven't been in that practice for a long time. I do write with my spouse, who's also a professor in psychology, but that is not like a colleague, that's my wife.
Well, talk a little bit about that. I mean, that partnership, how do you write and give each other feedback?
We're much, we have a secure base for disagreeing. So we disagree, and then we work together. We work together well. But I think what characterizes that writing partnership is very much more sort of a liberalism with respect to being quote unquote harsh, overriding each other's comments, knowing that the other one can also have veto power, and then sort of working with each other to negotiate. So I think in some ways that process of negotiation in marriage, right, where you kind of have to give and take and you sort of build together, also forms that general schema for writing together.
Okay. Besides collaboration, when you write something, to whom do you give it for feedback? How do you get feedback? What are you looking for in feedback?
Stephen King has a wonderful concept of ideal reader. And his ideal reader is actually his wife. So he's always thinking to himself, what would my wife say about this paragraph? And then he has a number of wonderful sort of catchy things to remember from that process. And I have tried to adopt the same. I look for ideal reader. An ideal reader in the academic context is a reviewer who wants to poke a hole in all of your logic, in every possible logic sort of thing. So you do yourself a favor, at least in the academic domain. I should say in the scientific academic domain, I apologize. By trying to think, well, is this going to look like I'm trying to sort of pull a shroud over someone's eyes, or is this going to convince people, or if I do this particular transformation of a given construct, is this going to fly? So I'm constantly editing for ideal reader, per se, and then the peer review process, at least in scientific psychology, has very much that. It's a built-in way to get feedback. Of course, there's rejection, acceptance, et cetera, et cetera. But that's generally how you seek feedback.
Okay. Speaking, I just want to check the time because I want to allow time for questions from the audience. But I do want to talk a little bit about, or I want you to talk a little bit about your reading. You mentioned Stephen King a couple of times, Alice Sebald, Michael Crichton. What are you reading right now? What's on your bedside table?
Right now, nothing.
Okay.
Yeah.
A week ago.
So what I like to read is, I've always loved the Best American Short Story series. I love to read New York Times articles. I love Manohla Dargis's movie reviews. And I recently read a book by Alice Munro. You can see that there's a short stories. So short stories have always been sort of my thing, and I loved the Best American Science Writing series for a long time. So, and I read academic articles quite a lot, and so part of my struggle really is sort of keeping this. Keeping alive both the sort of the fiction, right, sort of pleasure reading, as well as the keeping up with the scientific literature. The reason that there's not a bedside book at my table right now is because because of this struggle that I'm mentioning with so many roles. What I was reading last night was actually a paper that I have to make an editorial decision for. Does that make sense?
It does.
So I serve as an editor for a journal.
Yes. How has your writing and your reading, how does that play into your teaching style? I know you teach the writing workshop, but is there a interrelationship among writing, reading, teaching?
Absolutely. And I have had colleagues who talked to me about my blog and said, well, what are you going to do with it? Are you going to put them all together and publish them as an anthology? In other words, the implicit assumption was that there would be a physical publication that you could put on a CV for advancement. And I realized that wasn't really sort of the product that ultimately was necessary for me to feel like it was successful. The writing, as I mentioned, right, is itself a thought process on how to understand and frame and talk about phenomena. And quite spontaneously, I would then be able to talk about these phenomena right, with my class. So there's a facility that I feel I have now between reading or talking to students or teaching about a scientific concept or article and spontaneously thinking, oh, and that reminds me of this time I was in, and I would say about 30% of the time, those metaphors or those links are a little bit wacky and in outer space. And they're not entirely successful in getting the point across. But I would say that leaves 70% of the time where people kind of really get it.
That's not bad, 70%.
And
yeah.
That's not bad.
Yeah.
So,
with that, I would like to open up for questions from the audience.
what do I do?
Can you repeat the question?
Can I repeat the question? I think the question has to, the question was, I'm going to try to reconstruct, I guess, the spirit of the question, which is that when you write blogs, sometimes the comments are nasty and sometimes they're actually very helpful. How do you deal with that, right? So for a long time, I just didn't read the comments, right? So I think early on I was like, what are people saying? Ooh, oh. So I didn't go there. I couldn't deal with it. But after a while, I began to read them and tried to not take the bait. Right? The internet has a very peculiar quality of somehow allowing people to be a lot nastier than they otherwise would be in real life. It's the same thing that happens with road rage, that there's this depersonalization that goes on, right, when you write. And so you develop a thick skin, but what I would try to do is try to take a comment, and I was going to read one to show you a little bit, but try to take comments that sort of helped me advance the argument, like in my next blog or something, right? Again, without sort of, getting into screaming matches or well, you're wrong or whatever, but this reminds me of this other thing that I didn't mention, right? Or there's this alternative possibility. And so it's kind of like this funny self-restraint process, as well as constructive process with other commenters as well, right? And that actually happens also in the peer review process with scientific psychology, where reviewers are not always nice and not always helpful, and you can have to sort of frame it or spin it so that it goes in another direction. So I very, very, very consciously try to not spin, but frame comments so that they end up in a place that I think is helpful. Yeah, but I also do a lot of not reading comments.
Yes.
Sort of related question. I was thinking when you were talking about your reaction to getting the 250 hits as opposed to 1 million.
Yeah.
I was wondering how much that felt to you like a version of you're smart, you're not smart, good effort, that kind of thing.
Oh, totally.
So I guess my question is, in some respects, how you get past moments like that, like assuming that the like or the hit reads like you're smart or not as smart as 1 million hit.
And
what do you do to get
it's not just about being smart, and I talk about these in my blogs. It's not just sort of a question. I think at a deep level, I get a kick out of my own writing, right? So like, there is a sense of healthy esteem there. But what it consistently activated was this feeling of like, well, it's kind of like, is it worth it? Maybe I don't belong, right? Which is a slightly different construct, but but it is a question about sort of social relevance. Right, and one of the things I find is that a lot of what we do really is about remaining, staying, being, getting to be socially relevant. Right, so I took those as strong indicators of social relevance, and it's been I can't deny that I continue to struggle with it, sort of, particularly with high-achieving colleagues, around Berkeley, that are highly socially relevant. It's kind of like when you at a conference or at a party. It's very similar to like people not talking to you, or sitting by yourself with a glass of wine or what have you. It's that same icky feeling, and then so in a very real way, I've used the blogs many times to try to sort of talk myself, through that process, to try to, and I think at some level I did fall victim to it in that I stopped, and then couldn't quite get back on. So that struggle continues, and so there's always also the knowing what to do and then actually living it, very much like that writing at a specific time each day kind of thing. So the demons remain, very much.
Yes.
When you finish writing a blog, will you revise it? I mean, proofread it again and revise some?
No.
Can you repeat?
Sorry. Do I revise, like if I post a blog, do I then revise it? And the answer is no. And that was part of the gift to the self after tenure, which was, I really want these things to be out there, not like, I wanted them not to be like the journal articles or the endlessly revised book chapters. And there's a way in which after a certain point, it's good, it's fine. Let it live its life, right? So I try not to touch them too much. I mean, and there's, I do correct little mistakes here and there, and I have changed a sentence above or below, but not that much, really.
We have time for one or two more questions. Sorry.
But when you're writing the 2 hours of the blog, so you had said after you post it, you don't edit it. But do you do what? It sounds like it all just comes out and you don't change anything.
No, I definitely do change it. So like it all comes out like big old stream of consciousness. And that's what I was doing at Free Speech Movement this morning. I was writing that letter, and there's all the points are kind of there, right? But then you really have to think, how am I going to organize it, or what's the intuitive organization of it that will help you. And for the blogs, it's sort of hook, study, conclusion that links it back, right? Maybe a little joke kind of thing. And for academic writing, it's the same thing. What's going to be the thing that foreshadows what you want the audience to sort of, how you want to kind of steer your audience. And so but that happens, at least for me, fairly quickly. In shorter pieces. I'm having an incredibly, right now I'm having this incredibly difficult time because I'm trying to write a theory-based paper, which is supposed to be much longer, and I'm not used to revising and writing for long periods of time and putting it all together. So, I can't say that I'm any kind of expert at writing longer pieces, even though I've done it. This one is a different animal. But I guess I should say I look forward to the challenge.
Yes.
I just wanted to talk about the rewrites. And when you write like an academic paper, you have your draft, so you have to rewrite the paper. And I'm wondering if there is a status where you get into bored of revising, like you revise your paper for like over 10 times, then you kind of bored of it. Like how you deal with it and how you get through this period.
So the question is about revision and whether one gets bored of a paper and what you do when you get bored or sick or kind of hit a wall. Usually I go away for a little while and then try to come back to it, and there's certainly plenty of things to do. But you can also shift perspectives. So and I think I do a lot of that. So when there's a draft and I don't see an obvious kind of way out, or I kind of get bored, I actually start things like checking for commas, or do I put a semicolon, or do I use 2 instead of 4? So very sort of micro level things that still help me feel like I'm being a useful engine. That's a Thomas the Tank Engine reference. And then after that, generally what happens is there's also research on how unconsciously, when you're not working on something, ideas or solutions pop up. And often I'll let it sit, and I'll be like, oh, maybe I can do that. And so as a matter of fact, on the way here, from the free speech to this room, I had an idea of the very first thing I need to say in this letter that I was writing. And that was not the first thing. Now, even in this narrative, right, you'll notice that I'm exercising this funny relationship between what I do, right, focusing from the very concrete to the very abstract, and then relating that to this research on unconscious processing of information. So, and that, I think, sorry to veer off topic, but that's part of what I love to do, part of what helps me teach, and part of what has helped me write with the blog. But yeah, you can focus on different levels of analysis, you leave it alone, and sometimes you just have to, you could ask for feedback from others, but you also, but you can't strive for absolute perfection either. You're welcome.
And on that note, I want to thank you so much
Thank you, everybody.
for joining us.